So from verse 3 through 20, Mark chapter 4.
Listen! A sower went out to sow. And as he sowed, some seed fell along the path, and the birds came and devoured it. Other seed fell on rocky ground where it did not have much soil, and immediately it sprang up, since it had no depth of soil. And when the sun rose, it was scorched, and since it had no root, it withered away. Other seed fell among thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked it, and it yielded no grain. And other seeds fell into good soil and produced grain, growing up and increasing and yielding 30-fold, and 60-fold, and 100-fold.
And he said,
He who has ears to hear, let him hear.
And when he was alone, those around him with the 12 asked him about the parables. And he said to them,
To you has been given the secret of the kingdom of God. But for those outside, everything is in parables, so that they may indeed see but not perceive, and may indeed hear but not understand, lest they should turn and be forgiven.
And he said to them,
Do you not understand this parable? How then will you understand all the parables? The sower sows the word, and these are the ones along the path, where the word is sown. When they hear, Satan immediately comes and takes away the word that is sown in them. And these are the ones sown on rocky ground, the ones who, when they hear the word, immediately receive it with joy. And they have no root in themselves, but endure for a while. Then when tribulation or persecution arises on account of the word, immediately they fall away. And others are the ones sown among thorns. They are those who hear the word, but the cares of the world and the deceitfulness of riches and the desires for other things enter in and choke the word, and it proves unfruitful. But those that were sown on the good soil are the ones who hear the word and accept it and bear fruit 30-fold and 60-fold and 100-fold.
Now, what I wanted to do, and I capture that, is that parable, that story is not only in Mark's account, but it's also in Matthew chapter 13, verses 18 through 23, and also in Luke chapter 8, verses 11 through 15. So if we called Matthew, Mark, and Luke as witnesses and told them, tell your story, and put these all side by side, you're going to discover some things that are amazing. So in this parable of the sower, in my introduction, I would obviously read it. I would say, and Jesus explained the parable. So the interpretation Jesus himself gives. And what's funny about this interpretation, the reason why I chose this is because many preachers have been guilty of preaching this sermon incorrectly. And I'm going to point out why momentarily. So first of all, we see that Jesus says, a sower sows the word. Did you know that when he explained it, instead of saying he sowed the seed, he chose that word, the word? I looked up that word as I was preparing for this class. So 2 years ago, that didn't even stand out to me. That is the word logos. Jesus became the word. He became the logos in the beginning of John's gospel. Interesting that it's in Mark's, not in John's. So the sower sows the logos. He's sowing the gospel story. His word is the seed, the gospel. God sows into our hearts. Our hearts, as Jesus explains in his interpretation, is the ground that the sower sows the word onto. So in the body, I want to go through the different grounds, the 4 different soils. Point 1, let's talk about the wayside. Jesus identifies this, and if I put all 3 of the Gospels side by side, these details I'm about to read to you stand out as something to be observed. The wayside. Those who hear the seed. Jesus said they hear the seed. Who hears seed? I eat seed, like sesame seed and sunflower seeds. I don't hear seed. Jesus says you hear the seed. Those who hear the seed, but we now know it's the word logos, it's the gospel that is sown by the wayside. Notice what he says. They do not understand it. Do not understand what? They do not understand the gospel. What else? Satan comes immediately. He snatches away that word, the logos, the gospel message that was sown into their hearts, lest they believe and be saved. I've been told many a times by many preachers that that is a believer who just has got a hardened heart and Satan robs them of the blessing. No, this is an unbeliever who hasn't heard, hasn't understood, and is not saved. I've heard many times that believers, these 4 different souls is the condition of a believer's heart. There's no believer in this verse. Let's talk about the stony ground. Those who hear the seed, again, there's a hearing of the seed. Those who hear the gospel, that's the seed, it's the logos, that is sown by the stony ground, they immediately receive the gospel with joy. Yet, he has no root in himself, but endures only for a little while. For when tribulation, persecution arises because of the gospel, they immediately stumble. This is not a believer. No one's saved yet. They immediately stumble. They receive it with gladness. They're glad to talk about Jesus. It's okay. But let some persecution come because of him. I'm not down with this. Let some tribulation come because of Jesus. I'm not down with this. They immediately stumble. Again, this is not a believer. This is stony ground. Verses 16 and 17 is actually the verses you would identify these things. Let's talk about the thorny ground, among the thorns. Those who hear the seed, the gospel, that is sown among the thorns, are the ones that the cares of this world, the deceitfulness of riches, the pleasures of life, and the desires for other things enter in, and they choke this gospel. They choke this logos, and it becomes unfruitful. Jesus said, I chose you, and that you would be fruitful. This is not a believer. But there are those who profess to be believers, and I will say this boldly because the Lord made this clear to me a couple of days ago, who would profess to be believers. They will be in a church, they might even be preaching, and because of the deceitfulness of riches and the pleasures of this world, they enter and they choke the gospel and they preach a different type of Jesus. And they're not from among us. So when there is a falling away, these are those who are falling away. These aren't real Christians who possess eternal life, but those who profess. I know I'm saying more than I probably should, but I'm telling what the Lord told me. And I saw this and said, wow. Now, among the good ground, those who hear this seed, who hear this gospel, that's sown on good ground, what about it? They receive it. They receive the gospel. They accept the gospel. They understand it. The other 3 didn't understand it. They didn't accept it, and they didn't receive it. What else? They indeed bear fruit. We just read that earlier. Jesus said, I chose you, that you will bear fruit. They indeed bear fruit, and they produce some 30, 60, 100-fold. That's the believer. This is not the condition of the heart of believers, 4 different hearts of a believer. That may sound good, and we can probably relate to it, but contextually, that is not what Jesus gave in his interpretation.
Oh, that's good. That's good.
I've never heard this before. I've never heard anyone preach this before. Yeah. 2 years ago, the Lord gave this to me as I prepared the class. And when I received it, I was amazed. I still had this. And when I'm studying for the class again, the Lord gave me more to identify what's going on in our world today. Those who are claiming to be Christians and are falling away. And why so many Christians have a small biblical worldview is because they never received that true knowledge of God.
That's it.
That's clearly why the deceptions of this world choke the gospel. And it's a social gospel now. Yes. And we have to go meet all these needs. And yeah, those needs are important, but that is not our calling. When the apostles, think of this, when the apostles had problems in the early church and the Hellenistic Jews had a need, they went to the apostles and said, hey, they're neglecting our widows. We need some help. They said, we can't neglect the word. They appointed others to take care of it. So those social issues got taken care of, but the leadership still had to take care of proclaiming the gospel message. That's powerful. So when I read Jesus giving this interpretation, this is not 4 conditions of a believer's heart. As a matter of fact, nobody yet was born again. Only in this one case was one who received and accepted and produced fruit. No one was born again. Not even the disciples who were listening to this weren't born again yet. They were disciples, They were going to be born again when Jesus fulfilled his work and poured out his Spirit upon them. We see that in the book of Acts. And I'm probably preaching more than teaching at this moment, but now I'm getting kind of fired up because I see this revelation clear. And only the text revealed it, and Jesus himself said it. And only recently did I realize that when he said that the word, they rejected the seed, he used the word. That word was the word logos. In his interpretation, he used himself. And then that's that old thinking that you can't trust the heart because it's desperately wicked. That's what the Old Testament says. But guess what? You've been given a new heart, a heart of flesh with new desires that comes from the Lord. And you know what that means? You can produce these 30, 60, 100 folds because Jesus said you will. Conclusion. The Son of Man came to preach, to sow this gospel, the seed. And so faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the word of Christ. That's why you read Romans 10:17 in that passage afterward. Our hearts are the ground that Jesus sows this gospel into. We can choose to receive it or reject it. Those whose hearts are by the wayside, they do not understand. Satan snatches away the truth of the gospel, lest they believe and be saved. That was Jesus' interpretation. Those whose hearts are by the stony ground, they delight in the stories of Jesus, but they have no root. They are not grafted into Jesus the vine. That's why they have no root. They fall away at the first sign of trouble because the word becomes an offense to them. Those whose hearts are among the thorns, they allow the cares of this life, the seduction of wealth, the desires for other things to choke out this gospel, this word, so that it produces nothing. But those whose hearts are on good ground, they receive the gospel, they accept it, they understand the gospel of grace by faith, and they indeed produce 30, 60, and 100 fold. So what is this good ground? It's a heart that hears, receives, accepts, and understands what God has done for you, for me. Are you willing to receive this free gift of salvation by faith in Jesus Christ?
The end.
The end.
That was good.
And that was just sermon preparation.
You need to do that. You need to preach that sermon.
You need to tell the pastor.
That is good. Amen.
The end.